Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Screen is visible, right? Okay, so the presentation that I'm going to make to you today is about geography, adaptation, and cultural forms. And this is what the exercise is around. Looking at the cave paintings in Lascaux and other places like Bhimbetka, one wonders what our ancestors would have thought and how they would perceive their environment. And that environment clearly from these drawings themselves must have changed considerably in the time between these drawings. One shows animals wild, untamed, and the other shows them as cattle with men and in certain types of organizations. Around the world, we see people living with animals, living in certain kind of geographical uh, areas. These geographical areas have certain types of features, water, land of a certain quality. I've been discussing with many of y'all and relating to y'all how when we think of water as H2O, we generalize it as all waters being equal and all waters being the same. I also related stories of my experiences, and it was with Professor Chaya while working there, that when one moved from village to village, you found that there was water of different quality and different types and different characters. We sometimes call it hard water and soft water, but those are very simple kind of differentiations. These are waters with a great deal of character, and some of them characters which are treacherous. The line between land and water not stable. And the people who live in these kind of geographies have to organize themselves in manners that they may perhaps move, perhaps rise and fall with the water, uh, and to be able to take their most precious things with them, the animals, and in some cases, some artifacts that may go with them. You can see that there is a kind of modern building in this picture, along with the more traditional ones. And we can perhaps discuss what is the difference between the two a little bit later. But this is the way that people have been living for thousands of years, and in some cases, 6,400 in the order of things, sometimes even more. Those images I showed you were from Sudan in Africa. Sorry, I'll go. Sorry. But we have similar situations in different geographies here, in the sense, when I say similar situations, I mean that people are responding to a particular kind of landscape and organizing themselves in manners to be both agile and sometimes agile and secure, and to be able to adapt to that geography. We know these well. This is in Kutch, and here you can see parts of buildings being articulated to store things, grain sometimes, and other things as well. We know that in response to the climate and the kind of harsh realities of the surrounds, people build in certain manners, and there is a certain environment that is created with that. They live in a certain manner also, which is from which that house form and those structures arise. So here you can see there are these circular houses called bungas. They largely hold that which is important, but life, as you can see, happens in the spaces outside on a plinth that is raised slightly to separate the wild ground from the ground that is of the house. And they collectively form a kind of environment, a built environment that is of this type. In that kind of situation, if one wants to live, one may have to do things. There is not much, there is little available, and with the sparseness, one goes to collect water, finds water, returns, and therefore a certain set of activities around that way of life and certain organization of who should do what develops over time. There is a kind of sense that somehow people from a very long time ago were innocent, and that there is this idea of the noble savage. But in some ways, the forest dweller was also engaging in adapting to an environment. Here is an Adivasi who is burning parts of the forest for many reasons. To allow certain species to grow in and allow others which are not so useful and impede the growth of the species he may want, and therefore creating a certain selection and allowing that to shape the environment. It's perhaps not a very it's a controlled way of engaging and transforming one's environment. Some of these processes get ritualized, and over time, this is in Japan, they burn the whole mountain as a ritual. They say that the spirits of the forest are to be kept away. In truth, maybe the ritual arose from keeping the wild boars away from the settlement. And these were ways in which rituals developed and festivals were created. And the environment was shaped through the activities, both individual and collective, of people. These, of course, these rituals then get articulated in very interesting and detailed manners. But there is also other, and as things develop, there are from that particular subsistence life style, not lifestyle, what would you call it? Life emerges agriculture, and that agriculture arises out of the domestication of plants and animals. And just as the Adivasi in the photograph made certain selections by burning perhaps weeds and shrub of certain types, the domesticating process involves the making of a boundary, separating the wild from the domestic. And in that, what is within the boundary is the environment that is controllable, and that is very slowly changed in order to favor the species that is to be domesticated. And this is a kind of grass that is called sheep's foot in certain parts of South America. And on your right side, you see its wild variant and the domestic variant on its left. And you can see how the seeds which are scattered, the grain, the seed which is scattered on the right side, bunches together over a period of time by the selective processes that it was subject to. The processes are actually quite similar, and this is barley. This is also barley, and you can see the wild ears on top and the domesticated one below. And you might look at this as a form of genetic engineering, but it happened through very simple processes of simply storing wheat. Simply storing the grain. And you might ask, what does that do to things? It does everything. By storing grain, the seed itself does not have to be subjected to, say, a winter or a change in the environment. Its seed coat, therefore, does not have to be as thick. When the seed coat is not as thick, a larger amount of the body of the seed uses up nutrition to grow, and the size of the seed itself expand, so to say. So you see, as this goes on, by the simple storing of grain, by not allowing the seed to be subject to the vagaries of the wild, the domestic variety has certain advantage. And in that advantage, it grows bigger or towards something that is more useful to the domesticator. You can see this in corn, and you could see it in rice and so on and so forth. So, I mean, this is just an example. On your left side is what wild corn used to look like. And on your right is what we know. It's interesting that when I came to Ahmedabad in 2000, there was, if you went on the highway in the monsoon, about this time of the year, all you could get was what we call desi makai. I've been roaming around for a long time, and in the last 2 or 3 years, it's very difficult to get it on the highways because everybody has uh, moved to American corn, which is the sweet corn variety of it. So this is what perhaps demand does to a particular kind of variant of corn. And there was a time when these were the kind of variants and diversity of corn that we would have got. It's interesting, therefore, that domestication, and this is perhaps something that we can talk about as well, reduces diversity. It perhaps perhaps leads to a kind of human uniformity of how would you say characteristics that the process should achieve. And then there are tools, which, as Bataille says, is the first instance when we start thinking about the future. It's an interesting thing, the tool, because the tool is not for itself. You're not making something now. You're making something that you will use in a particular situation mostly later. So the tool brings in the whole kind of dimension of time in a new way. And the kind of tools that you then get starts proliferating, and the things that you can do and the ways in which you can transform your environment is now not only by making a boundary and by controlling the behavior of the species, but by literally changing the environment in many, many ways. Of course, beautiful things happen with it. And, you know, this is a toy actually. And, you know, when children start, when there are toys for children, then the tool has been completely assimilated into a culture. New kinds of knowledge and new kinds of skill develop. On your left is a ceramic container for rice from China, from the Yellow River, which is about 4,500 years old. And it is an extremely sophisticated form of ceramics that was used at that point of time, from the silt of the river and from the needs of the agriculture of that area. On the right hand side, you can see that there is a kind of stone plate and probably a rolling pin of some sort. Is this meant to crush the grain, or is it meant to make a roti of some sort? We can speculate. And then there are the arts. There are symbolic things that are made which don't necessarily, they have a function, but they are symbolic of certain relationships that one would think of as important. Fertility, you can imagine, in an agricultural community might be one that is thought of in many, many ways, from a sexual, erotic one to that of the soil, and all of these would be embedded in the stories and the kind of the stories, the kind of art that was created so far. Fairly primitive, but this is Picasso. And it tells us something that I will return to about what we are trying to connect with in this studio. But also the fact that certain relationships don't change. And so one might look at early houses, but also structures that were not necessarily meant for living in, as kind of tools also that were where they um, they were responding to both the body of the person, but also all the kind of things that were done and were needed in the process of making yourself secure in that geography. Uh, and with that tool, there were things that gathered around the animal life, types of skills to make things. I put in the photograph of the tooth of the pig to show you of what happened to the tooth of the pig. On the right side is the wild pig, and on the left side, the smaller one is the domestic pig from around 3,000 years ago. And that means that the domesticated pig now can no longer live outside the pen. It cannot fend for itself and has become an integral part of this domestic world that we see in the photograph on the left side. There are tools, and tools are made with different types of skills, simple skills. But this is pretty much what the landscape in China would have looked like about 6,400 years ago. And it had been completely transformed from a forest to this kind of paddy land with that tool alone and a couple of axes. This is a very primitive form of spade, of a spade that was used for paddy cultivation. And a refined version, of course, was developed over time. So this idyllic landscape that we would often, pass in a train or in a car and, kind of longfully wish for, is far from natural in the pure sense of the word. It has been co-made by us. And here you can see that there are small adjustments being made, lines in the land, kyaris and kind of cultivation going on. But there are new types of tools. There are walls and boundaries of different types. And oops, I'm sorry. And you can see that there is a channel of water that runs to the right side of the. So, I mean, yeah, one can imagine that these tools are transforming the landscape, and the transforming landscape is being responded to again in the way that the houses, and which are in some sense part of this whole culture of tool making, is developing. And it's not very different from the way things are now. This is a rotatory seeder that was invented by a man called Jethro Tull. There's a music band by that name, and he's a 17th century inventor. And this is extremely, I mean, you can imagine for the 17th century, this is an incredible kind of tool. And it takes almost 200 years for a bicycle to develop when we already have this kind of understanding of machines. The question I have is whether we still look at our tools in creative manners and with the symbolism of that earlier time. This is also Picasso. Because if we are looking at our tools of today without that symbolism, without that ability to connect it to something larger, they become weapons. I'll go back in time because this is a photograph of Egypt, and one could go back to the Mesopotamia and so on, but we'll get a little more architectural here. And you can see the temple of Hatshepsut across the fertile land of the Nile. On the other side lies a cliff, a barren cliff, and across that, which of course is the Valley of Kings and the Queens, is the desert, the Sahara. And it's, I mean, sometimes one wonders whether it is, one wonders how this incredible articulate landscape was furthered by the pharaohs of the time, that all the mortuary temples on the western side, where there is no silting of the river, and because the silting happens to the east, it is the fertile. But the sun rises in the east uh, and sets in the west, and the desert is in the west. And this kind of tautology, this reiteration that what is to the west is of that which ends, death, the end of the day, and the beginnings are to the east. And this symbolism, this primordial one with the sun moving from east to west and the Nile moving from north to south, is that what gives them this incredible orthogonal understanding that you see uh, in their environment? But that's not that orthogonality is not there on the barren side. It's there only in the temples. The Sahara across that. And then is the pyramid, as Norberg should suggest, a man-made mountain trying to complete this as a sacred geography. And in order to get people to build at the scale of the mountain, would we then need to organize ourselves in a different way, in a way where the collective is so strongly enforced with awe and power and scale? Look at the monumentality of those columns. If you look at the picture on the left side, you think that those are reasonably scaled columns with those, and then you realize that people just about come up above the pedestal. And it's not only in Egypt. At the introductory discussion, we were talking about Mexico and how the root of the word city is etymologically linked to mountain and river. But how do you build these structures? You can't build it with the kind of small-scaled banding of people that we saw in Bunny and Sudan. This requires people working together in incredibly large organizations, completely focused on a singular end, singular result, in order to give this kind of coherence to the landscape and to the engagement with the landscape. And of course, like in Egypt, there is an imagination of the landscape. It is in the scale of the landscape that one is trying to, that one is articulating these. In Angkor Wat. And do these structures then become the centers for the surplus that is created by this new system of agriculture? Not new by the time these are built, quite evolved. But what I mean to say is that the surplus that agriculture generates, who controls it? How is it organized into the building of these kind of structures? Srirangam, an island in the Kaveri, water systems. Would this concentric structure make sense if we did not know its geography? And with this comes many other things, marketplaces, people meeting in different ways, cultural formations, festivals, celebrations of good harvests, the need for prayer, perhaps when there wasn't a good one. So there, with the entire kind of adaptative process, there are also cultural forms that stabilize them and validate them within the daily lives of people. This includes the stories we tell ourselves, the rituals we perform, the kind of institutions we build. And it's those institutions that then generate their own needs. So let's take a bathhouse in Rome. It needs water from miles and miles away, and you get in that landscape an aqueduct which carries it to the city. I'd like to kind of, at this point, make this distinction between the responsibility of a large organization to provide water, while while the other one is the responsibility of the individual to take care of their own need for water. You can see that on the right, people will go, if you need water, they will go and get it. And on the left, you have an entire apparatus, a state, which is has a certain structure uh, of part at that point of time being elected and not, but of an entire apparatus that is able to do things at a scale that the individual can obviously not. And with that come institutions. This is the bath of Caracalla. I think it used something like 300,000 liters of water a day. I used to remember the calories that were burnt in order to heat the water of the tepidarium. And to build roads across an empire, to connect places that are far away, to put systems in place that allow Rome and allow all the roads to lead to Rome. Other types of other ways of coming together, people socializing, gladiatorial fights. Perhaps many of them holding that savagery that one had experienced from a time much before. The domus, or the house that the Romans built, had a room that was meant for debauchery, and it was always painted with the forest, with the iconography of the forest. Perhaps it was a longing for something that had been removed when the city of Rome had replaced the swamps between 7 hills. We've, for the last 100 odd years, we've had this sense that there is the city, which is this extremely built and not so nice place. And then there is the idyllic countryside. And a lot of us, when we go out simply from the city, we assume that this ideal is natural. It is not. It is been made by man, however beautifully it has been done. Been made as an adaptive strategy to exist in a particular type landscape. This is Ireland, where the steps, you can tell, are determined by a rock that perhaps does not allow the gentle contours of the soil that is here. So the environment is shaping the way people live. And this is quite literally so, where the walls that hold the terraces and the buildings are all made of the same material. In Cambodia, the lower picture is actually England. And the 19th century poets wrote extensively in romantic fashion about this landscape, the countryside. But this is not natural. This used to be forest in the land in the time of Robin Hood, which isn't so far back. A lot of that was completely used for the shipping that allowed the British to conquer and rule over much of the world. A lot of the same happened in Australia and in New Zealand to their forests. In India, it happened perhaps for the railways as well as other kinds of enterprise. The landscape gets adapted in many ways. That is the Netherlands with the tulip farms, mechanized to quite another level. The Dutch, of course, are the masters of artificial land. They built a country that was underwater and have with cartography and canal making, hydrology, been able to adapt to the most incredible situation. And what we often see when we are flying from one place to the other, the patterns that are that make the landscape. These patterns are in these patterns is embedded a kind of response, a certain kind of social structure that gives rise to these patterns. Salt is that commodity that built both Genoa and Venice. They monopolized salt in the Mediterranean for 300 years, and we know that this very simple material was one of the catalysts for our freedom. Many different types of landscapes, each holding within it a certain type of strategy that allows man to live. I use man as a general term. To live in some semblance of security and in that. But we as we have been discussing through the studio, we have our tools have become extremely powerful, and we are able to transform environments which were completely devoid of any habitation to environments that are which can be now inhabited. The desert in the UAE, I think. Just some more patterns, some that look like the machines that we make, the circuit boards of our computers, but that is an American city. And then there is Bombay, and in the middle, what you see, that outcrop on the upper photograph, that is Antop Hill. From what I understand, that's close to 3 billion years old. Do we have a narrative for it? Do we consider it to be part of our the scheme of our adaptive strategies? It does not seem so. I'll end this. I'll end this here and ask fellow instructors if there's anything they would like to add before we actually articulate the exercise.
Riaz, can I be the first one before
Yes.
I have to leave?
Please, sir. Please.
Yes. You know, there is the whole idea of symbolic architecture as being large and monumental. And that comes with the growing power of the state. Which requires a kind of flattening of the diversities that exist in a society. On the other hand, there are other kinds of cultural practices which depend upon a practice rather than a monument. That we have, for example, the notion of water as something which renews from time to time. And there are festivals where you carry water from one river to another river. There are festivals where you plant certain trees. These practices do not leave monumental effects. but yet they are equally powerful ways of carrying forward the idea on which a particular people are regulating their lives. And what is important to keep in mind in this studio is the fact that practices need also to be seen and generate the kind of places which represent something which is important to a people or to many kinds of people. For example, the Ganga is sacred, and so when the Chola kings had, they brought 1,000 pots from the Ganga to Kumbakonam, and every year there is a festival of the 1,000 pots of water being poured into the lakes in Kumbakonam as a practice which represents something of a value of water to that civilization. Similarly, tribal peoples have all kinds of things. They have, for example, sacred forests, which will be taken care of irrespective of anything else. And the value of the sacred forest is not from the products that it gives. It is not an instrumentality, but it is something which is a symbolic value which is carried by that practice. And so we should keep in mind that we are a country of millions of different practices which have arisen from many, many different forms of existence in geographies as diverse across the land. And if we try to make the state as the only symbol of an existence as maybe as a nation, yes, but as a civilization, then as a civilization, we will have to have practices also. So that just as Gangaikonda Chola brought the Ganga, we will have to bring the Kaveri to Delhi. We will have to bring all the rivers of India to Delhi. We will have to bring the animals that the tribals worship. We will have to bring the trees that they worship. We will have to bring all kinds of forms of rice which are there in the various parts of this diverse land. If the practices can counterpoint the monuments, then we have got a sort of a comment one upon the other. That in one sense, the state pulls things together, but the state is also something which is far too general to respect everybody's way of living. And therefore, the practices also have to come and inhabit the space which represents the totality. And I think this is what this exercise of geography leading to practices, leading to cultural forms, is an exercise which is meant to remind us that we are a land of many, many practices, and that we cannot abstract it into a single monumental form, and that the monumental form will be, after all, simply a device, but the living practices of all kinds Whether they are practices of clothing, they are practices of housemaking, there are practices of food, there are practices of taking care of animals, trees, plants, etc. All those practices somehow also stand for what this civilization is about. And this civilization has always had two parts. The part which makes the state. And interestingly, we have never been able to make the kind of monuments, the scale of monuments that, say, the Mayans or the Egyptians did or the Romans did. Our monuments remain far too small. It might be a very interesting thing to draw at the same scale all these monuments. And that we have privileged practice over the freezing into monuments as a civilization. Just as China has, Japan has, and African nations have, South America has, so that it is only one sort of region of the world which made monuments to stand for civilizations. Most other parts of the world looked at practices as something that represents a civilization. And I think there are some practices which will have to be bad. They were so bad that they have to be thrown away and they have to be completely erased. But there are the germs of ideas, of relationship between human beings and nature, which need to be represented as civilization. And I think this is what the whole exercise aims to find, not the monuments, but the practices as something which might, in fact, symbolize the existence of a civilization. I'm purposely not calling it a nation because you have, if you read Tagore, he's telling the Japs, don't make a nation. He's telling us, don't make a nation. But however, we have a nation. But the practices of the very few are as important, or sometimes more important, than the practices of the many. And I think this is something which this studio should really bring out. What are the practices of the few? What are the unheard voices? What were their practices? And how could they generate a new form of symbolization, which doesn't depend on monumental expression, but which depends upon inaction rather than building alone. And I think this is something, whatever you said in this wonderful presentation has to be complemented by this other notion that we are looking really at practices here, not necessarily at expressions of a unification. I think that's where I would like to add to what you've said.
I'd just like to ask you about perhaps a little bit to expand on the nature of collective when we are talking about the many and not the big. If I can put what you have said, that when we want to be able to talk about many things rather than the big. What would be the nature of the collective that you think is allowed for in this kind of civilization?
It is an expression of conversation. It is an expression of being surprised. It is an expression of being fascinated by the other way of living life. And I think it is a mutual interest in each other, a mutual sympathy to each other. Sympathy not in the sense that, oh, I sympathize with you, you are so poor, you don't have a house. That is one kind of, what I'm saying is there is a fundamental human interest in each other. And that interest in each other is the expression of the songs, of the languages, of all the kinds of things that we see as practices. And I think it may sometimes take a physical form, sometimes not find a physical form, but only a temporal or an inaction from time to time. And I think that is where we have to be a little more open to the idea that it is not so clean a slate. It is not so clear a picture. It is not clarity about who you are, but it is a fascination with the complexity of the conversation, the constant fascination with each other that can make this a symbol of a different kind. In my mind, the form is a great symbol, because in that all kinds of creatures and species and so on are in continuous interaction, sometimes competitive, sometimes cooperative. And that kind of, can we think of the city as a kind of forest of a different kind, rather than a organization of human activity? Because we have continuously thought about cities from this economic viewpoint as productive places which are organized for greater efficiency. Whereas most earlier forms of existence took efficiency for granted, that every person in doing their work will try to find the best way. But they took the richness to be the characteristic of human existence. And I think it is that which we need to somehow into Delhi not as the absolutely clear expression of what India is, but Delhi as that bubbling forest-like entity in which uh, the currents from all over come and inhabit. Then what will we get? Will we get something which is perhaps seemingly chaotic, but somehow capable of supporting a dialogue? This is where, and of course the answers we don't know, Riaz, but the questions are clear in my mind.
Is there anybody else who would like to respond?
I had some, you know, so I think from a few slides, I think there was some really wonderful. I mean, just the juxtapositions were beautiful. In terms of just purely as the graphic quality of two images, and then how different the content actually was. So it was really incredible presentation. And I had one or two things that struck me were because we're looking at geographies. One was, if one had to say hypothesize the kind of geological strata that's available in Delhi, and if one had to seed so this is actually a response to the salt image, right? Like where you have this massive salt pans. And I was wondering that, if this was such an important resource in the past, which actually seeded cities and civilizations, what if, for example, in the future, one discovered a massive lithium deposit under the Central Vista, right? Where, for example, the value of that deposit, just in terms of its value to civilization, it far outstrips anything in terms of value that is happening by human activity above it. This sort of just a purely geological consideration as to national wealth, and this whole site becomes a future mining site, for example, where you have massive strip mines running across, So I was thinking, like, I mean, in my mind, I'm anyway going to work on this. I'm going to be as much of a participant as an instructor in this studio, I think. So I'm going to maybe try to simulate some of these massive strip mining happening across, Delhi, which is in an effort to discover this kind of, future resource, because lithium is going to be, powering all our
Yeah, but,
batteries
Ayaz,
and.
if I have to take Professor Chaya's provocation, you have to then imagine a mining system that is decentralized and that is of, I think Professor Chaya mentioned in his presentation how the mining of iron lay with the Adivasis. And it actually reminded me of another point in history, which is when the Huns actually kept attacking Rome. The Huns had the technology of the horse, and the Romans were really battered because of these guys. And they were the herdsmen of the apocalypse, if you want. They almost caused a downfall there. But what I'm saying is, and even when you look at when you start looking at history in terms of the Mughals and the incursions from Central Asia, it's about the economy of speed and the technology of the horse. And what I'm saying is that it lay with people who organize themselves in certain very, very loose ways that allowed the landscape to coexist with all of this. I don't know if you've read this guy, Peter Frankopan's book, where he talks about the development of the horse and how the technological knowledge was traded and who was allowed to have that knowledge, etc. I don't know, it perhaps needs a kind of economist or social theorist to talk a little bit more clearly about how that led to certain types of adaptative, kind of responses. But I think the question is more as to how do you prevent, let's say, the lithium deposit becoming part of a singular process that is controlled by only a few people. And then what happens to that strip mine?
Sure. So democratic ownership of a strip mine. That's very
that
cool.
Also with lithium. Huh? You're not allowed to let Elon Musk buy it.
Yeah.
It's not just democracy. It's something that is arising out of the sense of adventure that a few people indulge in. And the nomad or the pastoralist has this sense of adventure. And he has been, or she has been, a major part of our civilizational forces, both the hunter and the pastoralist. And today, they're known as primitive people who need to be settled, whose private ownership of land needs to be fixed. And it is all these mechanisms which the project can question. And it is the idea of bands of people rather than huge collectivities, which in my mind hold a lot of interest for the future. That if we start becoming little more capable of being happy with the small adventures, then we are going to have a different kind of civilization. And that is something, the resources for that are available in all over the country, in the practices of the people. And I think it is that resource which is also needing to come and become foregrounded.
I would love to hear what other participants have to say, because I think this really opens up all sorts of conversations. I just want to pull out a few things from this fantastic, fascinating discussion. One is, I think there's a lot of agency beholden within the participants. They get to decide which practices they choose. And I think one of the things Professor Chaya said just in passing struck me quite a bit, that there are some practices that should be shunned, that can be censured. And there are other practices that should be celebrated. And so it's up to you. It is beholden on you to decide which ones you wish to bring. And I think that in that, for me, is a very interesting conversation, because there is a certain open-endedness, I would like to presume, in this idea of bringing practices. It is not just anything, right? And I would love to hear more, perhaps, because I think we should proceed a little bit towards stitching together what this next exercise is in terms of this collage of practices.
I also think that there are practices within the state machinery which are also of value. For example, carrying a ballot box to the middle of the forest in Madhya Pradesh for one person to come and vote is a practice which I think is definitive of or defines the way our nation is in some ways. It could also be the practice within maybe government offices, the way that people come down for lunch and, you know, spread out on the lawns in around the government offices and have lunch together. I think these are also practices. They don't have to be necessarily pastoral or archaic. I think there are practices within our cities, within our modern cities, which are equally potent in terms of forming the idea of people.
You know, one very important thing in what Riaz said was the fact that no material is simply a material. That it, for example, he was talking about water, and he said that different villages have different kinds of water. And I remember a conversation that Riaz heard at the Narmada canal work was going on. And there were young people who were saying, wow, very good, now we'll have water and we'll be able to do farming and all that. And one old man who was sitting having tea with them said, but will this soil like the water from the Narmada? Because they're in Saurashtra, far away from Narmada. So in Gujarati, the word was, Chu e pani sadche. Sadche means, will it go well with these people? Will it give so that the fact that we have now made everything into H2O, whereas the real sense of our relationship to the forest or to the ballot box or to the is a relationship of value, distinctive value. And that distinctive value is expressed in the sensing of the gentleness with which you offer it, not in the bravado of how you impose it. And that ballot box for one person is the gentleness which is offering something, rather than saying, go and vote, otherwise we'll fix you. Yeah. So I think there is an entire psychology that goes on behind this notion. And that is where the architecture is extremely expressive of these things. That the expression of gentle welcome is different from the expression of power. And I think this is where a lot of the things what Riaz was asking, how do you bring all those things together? It is that welcoming sense. And I think the welcoming sense has to come back into this whole project of Delhi.
So maybe just to simplify it for some of the participants, just what the exercise expects from you. If I put it down in a few sentences, because we will discuss it in this engaging manner throughout all the conversations you'll have with us, because you must have already figured out that nothing remains simple. So basically what we are asking you to do is to imagine a geography that you're familiar with, to choose it. As Sarosh said, it's really important that you choose it, and that it could be what you live in and that you're familiar with, but it might be, as Professor Chaya suggested, something you're fascinated with. And it is an agency that you have to imagine this geography. So first thing in this exercise is to imagine that geography. The second is to imagine, and this is in the same spirit of the first exercise, to imagine a set of adaptative strategies that one might use in order to stabilize one's existence in that geography. And to then imagine the cultural forms, which means what are the kind of things that we were talking about in terms of daily life tools, shaping your immediate pig pen if you have one, growing some wheat if you need it, or if lithium works for you, that's fine. I mean, so the thing is to kind of then build a world in that geography. So whereas the first exercise was large and was in some sense abstract, this one will be anchored in the geography of your choosing. So is that reasonably clear? I hope it is.
So I have a question. Do we have planetary restrictions?
No.
Okay, sweet. Thank you.
But just so that just so that you understand that you will have to bring it to Delhi in some manner or the other in the end. So just keep that in mind. I'm no problem if you have decided that it's Mars or the moon or wherever else. But the relationship to Delhi will be something that we will be asking you to creatively build. Okay, so if it is, and in fact, it was while kind of putting this presentation together, the last slide was supposed to be a photograph from the space station looking down at Earth, but I forgot that.
The little blue dot.
Yeah, no, Delhi. But okay. The question would be then, what is it you imagine on that extraplanetary settlement, wherever you think of it, and Delhi? That is not something that is compromisable in this studio. So that's something that we will hold you to. So yeah, that's fine.
Riaz, I have a question as well. So when you're asking me to imagine a geography that I'm familiar with, so this, like, because I come from the Northeast and there are areas that I am familiar with, which are very different from everything else, which forms our mainstream kind of, even the idea of India for that matter. So is it something where I could build on something that already exists and there are cultural practices that already exist there, even though they might not be very well known or very well documented, but can I take some of the existing cultural practices and then build further on it, but also like all existing cultural practices, like the existing world that already kind of like is there, rather than starting from scratch? Because I mean, none of these are well documented for that matter.
Right. So Megha, just to kind of respond to that, because suppose you are saying that there is something in the Northeast, but you have left it and you are elsewhere, and you feel that where that geography needs to respond to new things and new situations that it has not done for whatever geographical or other reasons. Yeah, sure, you can take it and develop it from there.
Yes, can I add something to the power discussion?
Sure, please.
Yeah. So
I'm not the compere. Just go for it.
No, in case some participant wants to.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. So because I mean, it was a fascinating, lovely presentation. I loved it. So, and the discussions we had after that, and this kind of differentiation which we were trying to make between kind of top-down power and centralized power versus kind of, bottom-up practices in a sense. I think it's important for us to remember that no practices are devoid of power. Right, so in that actually power seeps down right from the bottom, and power is in all of us. Like what Sarosh said, that all of us have the agency and all of us have the power also. So it's good to be conscious of it. I mean, in a sense, like, I mean, if I give an example of gender here, when we talk about, it's not patriarchy which imposes gender differentiation and kind of imbalance upon us. All of us practice it in our daily lives, right? We practice it in the way we move, the way women sit, Also, we produce gender in the way we practice. So so it's kind of all of us are part of this whole megalith of the power of certain kind in a way. So I think it's important to always remember that. So whether, I mean, those images that we showed up from the sky, and you have these agricultural lands which are strips. Some of them were strips, some of them were in a different way. And I'm sure it is because of a certain functioning of maybe how land is divided up between families or things like that, which is kind of producing those things, right? So things are produced from bottom up also. It's a network of power rather than a structure of power. So we have to imagine it like that. And therefore, this idea that when we think about practices also, not just because we are producing the practices, that they are going to be devoid of, that they're going to be neutral or something like that, which is what Professor Chaya was talking about, tired narratives. What happens is that we tend to buy into narratives in some sense, and it's important to be questioning also where our narrative is coming from, where kind of we are entering into it. So I don't know, I just thought this idea of remembering that power is not top-down is important in this. Since I mean, a jungle also has a power structure. It's part of that power structure. So I think it's not just the tiger is just the kind of imaginary king of the jungle. So I don't know whether it kind of changes the thing, but it's I don't know, interesting to think about it in that way.
No, I think it's a very important thing because we tend to look at certain situations as idyllic. I think that was also the reason I was looking at this whole image of the Adivasi man as being this noble savage and so on and so forth. He does even now. If you go into that Nagpur area, they burn large tracts of forest to maintain a certain genetic range. It may not be as specific as industrial farming, but there's a genetic range that they do maintain through certain practices, as we've been talking about. So, I mean, I think that I think it's a very well-made point and needs to be reiterated from time to time, because of this sense that somehow always bottom up is better. It is not. Yeah. I don't think that the direction should necessarily be given an a priori value, because sati and there are many other practices, as Sarosh was referring to, that needed to be eradicated, that came out of the same logic. So I don't think we should kind of forget that. So I think the point will have to be.
Small is always harmless, or small is always beautiful. Yes. I mean, Corona has taught us better also. So it's like.
Maybe, yeah, that's true.
So,
yeah.
Riaz, actually, this is sort of directed to you as well. Or maybe just from your presentation. It was a fantastic presentation, yeah. And very provocative sort of images like what Ayaz was mentioning. You used the word sort of shaping environments over and over again. And I sort of felt that through the presentation, there were different approaches to shaping the environment, and ranging from sort of controlling the environment all the way to engaging with it, if I may put it like that. And it did seem that you could see glimpses of that. It's not particularly to do with the scale of how big it is. It is also sometimes maybe to do with what the intent of the shaping is, or intent of your intervention is. Can you sort of elaborate a bit more on that? Because I thought some of the slides, the way you put them together, resonated that stark, distinct character where one sort of is almost controlling of it, and the other one more so is interacting with it in some way.
So there are, my sense of it, and I mean, I just from reading is that if I take a kind of context like Europe, okay, I mean, even as recently as say 1300, largely Western Europe is well, maybe a little bit before that, but largely it's a swamp. I mean, particularly if you take, I mean, let's take a place that one can kind of, that whole Veneto area around Venice, it's really a swamp which is infested with stuff. It's an adversarial kind of context if you want to inhabit. And I think you have, I mean, if you look at it, there is a military precision by which these landscapes have been made habitable. And there's no, I can't think of having a kind of, dekh lete hain. I don't even think you can have that kind of attitude in a place like Kutch. But I do think that in Kerala and in Maharashtra, because there's a certain fertility, there's a benevolence to the context, that there will be attitudinal differences in the way that you engage with what we consider nature. It's really interesting because Arnold Toynbee, the historian, said something really interesting, and now it's been debunked in many ways, but it's an interesting kind of thought because it's a good approximation. He says you need this right balance between adversity and the conduciveness of the environment to have a culture that leads to fine art. And he says you have to have that enough where you have to struggle and fight the environment in order to, and yet it's got to give you something back in terms of its fertility. So I think there are many things that even in, though you might find similar patterns, there would be differences in attitudes, and that's what makes places so specific. And I think sometimes when we talk about culture today, we do not talk about the specifics of these kind of responses. You assume that you will respond to heat in the same way. But whether it's humid heat or, I mean, we can get into all of that, whether there's salt in the air, all that kind of stuff makes so much difference to the way you deal with it. So I'm just saying that I mean, I think that attitudinally, there is a difference depending on what kind of pushback you get from the environment that you're in. And those are generational. That's part of the domestication of our species in that environment. There's this really interesting book about the onion, the history of the onion. I was telling some of the participants, where actually this guy's hypothesis is that we did not domesticate the onion, the onion domesticated us. And his simple premise is, tu dekh lo ki how much labor human beings put in order to make that species proliferate. Now, if that species is proliferating, if that's what the whole agenda of any genetic modifying behavioral process is, then it's the onion that's domesticated us. But what I'm saying is we are as much being transformed by that environment as the environment is by us. I mean, it's that feedback loop. So I think those attitudes get shaped in a particular manner, which then stay with you as a culture, or as Chaya was talking about, as a civilization. So, I mean, that's just, Vignesh, I don't know if I've responded adequately to what you said, but I think that's what gives the difference to kind of, so as much as you could say that, South India is pretty much similar climatically to let's say Thailand, I would say, the simple fact that Thailand is an archipelago and that, spatially it's broken up into little bits and you don't have expanse. Your sense of space would be, I'm imagining, be quite different from the way that you look at distance, volume, all of those kind of things that you perhaps respond to when you are responding to land, etc.
There's also this interesting, like, because a lot of, current practices, even power structures, they tend to terraform, right? Like you take essentially, you're shaping Earth in your image in many ways. So I think, I mean, one of the interesting things to think about is all the mundane practices that are shaping the Earth in extremely profound ways. Like the idea of, yeah, no, even like, just mobile phone towers. or internet infrastructure, or essentially sewage systems, and things which are being laid out as networks which support like they say, the way you tunnel through mountains to create paths for trains and stuff like that. So I mean, even to look at if this idea of the earth is constantly being changed, and if the practice that one is talking about is, like, say, just simple things like providing internet to a small suburb in Delhi, what are the kind of things that you would have to put into place as practices which just make your own business more efficient, and that may actually profoundly change the way one interacts. I mean, you start looking at trees and geographical features as hindrances rather than as assets, or something that is. I mean, people have actually dynamited places for these networks to kind of exist. Like, you'll find mobile phone towers in the middle of forests, and at least in Goa, it's a crazy contrast. Like, you'll find these lush green areas, and then you'll have one telephone tower sticking out in the center, which obviously has required X amount of people to put an X amount of lorries have to reach there and pour concrete there and all of those things. So it's something fairly mundane, but they have these kind of interesting ripple effects on the ecology.
I think I also feel that sometimes it's also how we have in time changed the way we represent the environment, because I think cartography has a lot to do with the megalomania of interaction in some way, rather than you being a part of the environment, changing it. But on the other approach, you looking at something which is you're not connected to it in the way, but thought acts on it, and it's sort of making decisions which spread across kilometers and kilometers of kilometers. Maybe it's also to do with the fact that we've represented environment in a certain way, and to interact with it, you don't interact with it in a direct way, but also have these tools that to interact with it. I'm just saying this because my nephew is actually 9 years old, and he plays this amazingly wonderful game. Some of you might know about it, called City Skylines. And if you guys don't know about it, please go have a look at this game. It literally gives you a greenfield city, and you get points by building stuff on it. And in a click, you can take like cubic meters and cubic meters of sand, fix and cut and make the city in one act. And this is sort of changing mentalities that the environment is something that can be tampered with in that sense. So you're looking at it from outside, and you have a clear sort of a medium to play with it, and then you change it in ways where you don't really understand the repercussions of in a longer run, I feel.
Yeah, maybe some of you guys want to jump in, because we can continue. So I would suggest that you guys kind of put your thoughts out there.
Some questions in the chat, and
Yeah.
there are specific questions and overarching kind of questions. I'm going for the specific ones. Does the way we handle waste count as practice? And somebody said, yes, I was thinking, or I was just writing Kapadiwala in the list. So yes, I would say, I would think so too. Then somebody says, does relating the chosen geography to Delhi mean to assess how Delhi would respond to it?
No, that I would say that right now, don't worry about it. Just keep Delhi in mind. But right now, just engage with the geography and the ideas you have about how and what you think you want to adapt to.
So there is, there is the monument of statewide practice, but there is also the monument of people practice, and you refer to it as rituals, how it becomes a ritual or a festival, and that itself is monumentalizing a daily practice in some way. There is also customs, which is a curious word within that whole ecosystem of words. And custom, where there are customs like in Malaysia, they point with the thumb to a direction rather than pointing with the forefinger, or there are customs of spitting on the bride in Greece, for example, during the wedding. And so there are odd kind of customs, curious customs, which also come out of a certain belief or practice. And I think that there are interesting, perhaps anecdotal ways that they have emerged, but there are also kind of possibly larger motives behind these, which could also be interesting to excavate and unearth. So I'm just laying it out there.
Perhaps I can talk to the question of how does civilization collapse. I think that that's kind of pretty wonderful. Yeah, and it ties to Riaz's fascinating presentation. I think that one must understand the kind of gravity of the moment right now, and I think that this notion of practices is a good one, because we have embedded in our civilizations various practices that can kill civilization or produce civilization. So, I think the virus, again, is an interesting example of, in Japan, people don't touch each other all the time. People don't spit. In fact, if somebody has to cough, they leave the room and cough outside. Like the coughing is an embarrassing thing, this idea of spitting everywhere. Like, whereas we have a different, I'm not trying to make an ethical or a value judgment here. We have a different association to feces. We have a different association to bodily fluids in our cultures. And maybe there are weird cultures amongst our own that are not like that, So I think that sometimes it is the aggregation of the small that can produce kind of strange totalities that we should be, or normalize certain tendencies that we should be aware of. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that, I think one should bear in mind that a lot of the things that Riaz showed, just 150 years back, the global population was 1 billion. Now we are 8 billion. So imagine that just in a period of 150 years, we have grown 9-fold. And not only have we grown 9-fold, our calorie consumption, our water consumption per individual capita has also increased exponentially, right? And so now one has to consider that the kabadiwala plays a very essential role, right? For example, the idea that in our cities, waste is processed through a certain caste structure, which is highly problematic, but at the same time, there is a system of processing. Now, one can bring that practice to Delhi, but then I think one should bring it with a certain openness that the practice itself can also be transformed. I think that that's very, very important, and that maybe strange connections and strange, I use the word strange because I don't think we should come there with a kind of a priori assumption. And like writing is tired, this notion of like bringing something and planting it elsewhere can also end up being tired. And I think we should be open to creating new linkages, new bonds, new systems, new structures that could have other kinds of intentionalities. But I want to go back to opening it up to participants, and would love to hear more from what they have to say.
I would like to talk about where our symbols are as civilizations, because I think most of what we saw on the presentations and what we have been talking about, it's about like the physical, so how it express, how we manage to adapt or change our environment, but that the way we do it has to do with the set of mind we have. I mean, Right now we are kind of like eating the whole world, because the whole world believes we all can have this lifestyle. The media and a bunch of structures have told us we need to, you know, every car, everybody wants to go to college, everybody thinks their kids need to have diapers, you know, and that the world cannot handle. And also we in this idea, I mean, our symbols, the things that are important, change from this taking care of the land to, for I mean, I can see it, for example, in Mexico. The Mayans, the temples of the Mayans, much of them were inside the earth, were these natural caves where there's water. There's a water system that connects all these caves. They are called cenotes. So in the past, those were secret lands. You know, nobody could touch them. Nobody could go in there if there was not for celebration or something very specific. And right now, our mindset had changed that much that we think these are part of the economy. We need to exploit them. You know, there are stories going in there. Nobody cares about the symbolic things that happen there. I mean, nobody cares anything. So I can see how the symbolism of those places change to malls. You know, right now we don't go to cenotes to have celebrations. Right now we go to the mall to have a Black Friday, and that's our symbolism, and that's what we celebrate, and that's what it's shaping our cities. I don't know. I would like to imagine a dystopic future where, as we go to the Pantheon in Rome or the Parthenon in Athens, we will go inside the malls and somebody will say, oh, and this is where people worship money, you know, because that was the most important thing in the world. And these shaped cities, like nobody care about woods, nobody care about these sacred caves. Like we changed to that. So I think we need to analyze the symbols that shape our cities and shape our territories, because that's in the intangible, you know, the intangible becomes tangible, you know, like as we think, we print the footstep, you know, like there's the way we're thinking, what it's shaping our earth. So I think it will be very interesting to understand how these symbols change and are switching, you know. For some civilizations, touching the woods just to put a tower of communication or an antenna would be unthinkable, you know. So I think that's very interesting, like just to analyze how our symbols switched, and then the territory did too.
There's one interesting, again, you know, added layer to what you're saying. Is very interesting. There's something called the boomtown curve, right? So it's this, it kind of appears in many different, you know, data sets, where it's this sort of double humped curve, you know. So I mean, it's like, for example, if you discover a new resource, like you discover, say, gold, or you discover lithium, or you discover, you know, some kind of new earth resource. There's the few early adopters are the people who actually are the prospectors, the people who, like, I think Professor Chaya mentioned, you know, the sense of adventure and the sense of, you know, the people who are the first prospectors of this new resource. They move in and they are the first profiteers. Then there's a level of stagnation that comes in. So that's when essentially their capital expenses are maxed out. Then the next big curve happens when government catches up, infrastructure catches up, you know, roads are built, networks are set in place to siphon off that resource and fulfill the world demand. Then it reaches its zenith, and then at the end there's a collapse. So essentially this sort of double humped curve kind of, you know, tends to recur through various different kind of data sets. And it's, I mean, we did a 200-year mapping of Bombay data, and we kind of saw this in theater, we saw this in the mills, we saw, like, you know, where things rise and fall very interestingly. And I think a lot of practices are also, they gain their symbolism, if one had to call it, depending on where they are on that curve. You know, if you are at the start of a resource, you value very different things, and you place your value in very different places. Whereas if you're at the, you know, at the edge of the curve, like, say, one could argue that we are on the edge of the population curve, and, you know, where we're at is right now witnessing the beginning of a large crash, because the system we're in is not capable of handling the load that we've placed on it as a civilization. And then where we place value on health would have been very different from where we would place value on health, say, 20, 25 years ago, maybe on health practices or health rituals. Right now, earlier in Indian culture, when people walk into your house, you'd welcome them with a glass of water, but right now you'd probably welcome them with a hand sanitizer, right? So, I mean, there's a vast shift in terms of the way we look at someone who's entering our house. So I think these, and depending on where you are on this curve or where you perceive you are on this curve, because you never really know where you are on the curve. That's always in retrospect. But where you perceive you are on that curve and what your health what your health perception is or what your risk perception is, that shapes many, many practices. So it could actually, just to add to your point, actually.
I also think Percy, sorry, you want to continue that?
No, yeah, just about like these curves and everything. I mean, I think that's very, very interesting to understand. But also thinking about like these curves and this way of thinking, they should also now be local. Like not global. But I think needs to go back to the to local things, because it's the same. I mean, if we all believe we can all travel by plane, and we can all, for example, with the lithium thing, that okay, now we have a huge amount of lithium, but if we all continue to believe we all need cars now, electric cars instead of the other cars, now we are gonna change everything, and now everybody, instead of going for the oil, they're going for the lithium, and that's a never-ending story. Yeah. Because we believe we all need cars, and we all need to travel by plane, and we all need diapers, and we all need everything. These things that they are nonsense. Like, we need to come back to local. I mean, if in India there's lithium, maybe India can take that and create something local, but not to export to Germany, not to export to the US, not to export to crazy places. I just saw this image on Facebook the other day about peaches. I don't know if they published it in the group, or I don't know where I saw it, but there are canned peaches that came from Brazil and were canned in Thailand and sold in the US. So how crazy is that? Like, how we waste energy and resources to do this crazy stuff, because people in the US, they need peaches from Brazil that were canned in Thailand. I mean, it's just, I mean, we need to go back to local, to understand how we can live with our territories, and just, in that sense, maybe we can create better relationships with the earth and in society, but we need to change that mindset. Like, people need to understand that it's okay if not all of us have children. It's okay if not all of us go to college. It's okay if not all of us have cars. And it's okay if not all of us go to Paris to see the Eiffel Tower. I mean, what's the point,
I think it's what you're also saying is what a civilization holds sacred and what it says is profane. And I think these two words have become so out of currency these days, because we don't hold anything sacred anymore. And that the fact that those people could not enter the caves earlier because they thought that it was sacred not to enter. And now it is not a problem. And because we have nothing which is sacred. And I think that notion of sanctity, which a lot of Indian civilizations, not a lot of Indian cultures throughout the country had, or still hold on to, is something that we perhaps need to kind of revisit once. What are these things which are sacred to us? And including interfamily relationships, including the way we enter, which Ayaz was pointing out, that whole aspect of having a guest at home, and the notion of what a home becomes to that guest is also very interesting as sacred. But profanity, and that is also something which is, has lost currency, because we don't consider anything profane anymore. Everything is fine, everything works.
I think participants can unmute themselves and ask questions, or even suggest practices that they're thinking about, because I think it would lead to a more an inclusive conversation.
I think Vasupriya wants to say something.
Well, actually, since you were talking about a lot of practices, I was kind of reminded of this one practice that started and turned into a sort of religion in this very remote island of the south of Australia or something, where it was a very remote island and only like tribals lived on it. And I think around World War I or World War II, there was planes that flew over and dropped food and water and all on the island for all of these guys. So anytime that a plane flew over, these guys used to think that it's actually Messiah kind of flying over. So they started a whole cult practice around worshipping the airplane, because they would sort of start to think that, you know, oh, this is something that is kind of going to bring us like goodwill or something of that sort. So, I mean, it's not related very, very directly to what we're talking about, but it was just kind of an offshoot that I kind of remembered. Which was really interesting in that sense, because when you start to think of practices, you kind of go back to thinking what starts the origin of that practice. You know, what is it about it that kind of makes you continue doing it again and again, and how does it kind of turn into it? What is the thought process behind it with different people and with different cultures? So yeah.
Reminds me of the movie Gods Must Be Crazy, where somebody chucks a Coke bottle in the middle of Africa, and a tribesman finds it and brings it back to the village, and they are absolutely fascinated with this glass Coke bottle, and they try to use it as tools. And I think it kind of encapsulates all the notions of practice, of sanctity, of evil, or whatever it is, and how it's kind of turned into an object which is not salubrious or not correct for the village. And how I think that whole film was amazing.
When you ask that how, I mean, the origin of it or something, there's a text, I don't remember the author, called Hygiene and Cleanliness, which basically, I mean, it's not necessarily related to a practice, but how the portrayal of dust as something bad, or cleanliness or hygiene as something we should adapt in our daily lives, has affected various sections of society, starting from painting your house brown to instead of painting your house brown, you paint it white, or how women should keep the house clean and not the men. So that's a very interesting read. If someone wants to go through it, I'll find a link and put it on. It basically shows how a small idea, whether it's a marketing strategy or it's a practice, affects a wide spectrum of the society and your day-to-day errands.
The hegemony of sanitation is something that even Shilpa might want to elaborate on, in terms of the entire gender difference between men and women based on an idea of hygiene, of how women at one point were just labeled, or still are in some places in India, labeled unhygienic because of the menstrual cycles. And that kind of, you know, even that sense of what hygiene or sanitation can do to societies is something that is mind-boggling, in fact, one to think about it.
On a lighter note, I wanted to add, like, the way culture takes over modernism, like how in Thiruvananthapuram airport closes twice a year for the biannual procession of Padmanabha Swami temple, wherein you know, these priests, they carry the symbols of the Garuda Vahanas of the Padmanabha Swami temple, and they walk across the entire runway, and the runway and the entire civilization is shut, where the culture takes over, you know, and it is a practice. So it is shut for a few hours, 2 times a year, every year for the last 200 years. So the practice is more supreme, and modernism steps back to accommodate it.
We have similar situations in Ahmedabad where there's a dispute between a Devi mandir that has come up in an area which is interestingly called Hollywood for those who know it. And the BRTS route, which has to move on a straight line, is going to have to be majorly twisted in order to adjust to that temple. So in some sense, it's a similar kind of situation. What's really interesting is that the temple is considered permanent enough to cause infrastructure to deviate. But the people who built the temple, their housing, which is Hollywood and Gulbai Tekra, is still illegal squatter settlement. So it's for me, it's interesting how the house form can't find permanence, but the institutions that they kind of have reiterated through practice have made that permanent to a level that is, as you're saying, outstrips modern thinking.
When Professor Chaya mentioned the idea of practices around trees, how everything is not about the monument, but some of them are simply practices around the carrying of water or around the tree. So I've taken back to what my mother probably still does, but as a child, like I witnessed that, where there was a day dedicated to the amla tree, like not just any tree, but just the amla tree. It has a name. It's called the amlotsav or the amla nomi. That's what it's called. And it was a day when that tree was something. I mean, we had this giant amla tree in the garden, thankfully. But it was a day when there would be like women from the neighborhood who would also come to our garden to kind of worship this amla tree. So as a child, I found it strange. And in some ways, I continue to find it strange. But yeah, there are practices and rituals of kinds when it's something as tiny as like a specific tree becoming holy.
Hi, I would like to add something that has been on my mind since a long time. So I might be digressing, I don't know, but so I wanted to talk about how technology has a geography right now in major metro cities in terms of big, large industries, factories. So Mumbai does not have that, but obviously Vasai side, Virar side, the far off ends, they have those large spaces that have been taken over by technology. So if you start thinking about Delhi in the future, and you think about internet becoming like we start sourcing our own internet rather than getting it from pipelines, it's going to take up a lot of space around in and around Delhi, because internet has become something which is very important right now. And it's another world. It's definitely virtual, I'm sure, but it holds a space in the physical world for now. It might have a larger space that it'll need eventually. Also talking about how metros have been starting to take a lot of space, and how the geography, I'm not talking about the physical geography that used to have landscapes and but I'm talking about something which is man made and something which is going to be very mandatory eventually, because nobody's going to go back and not talk about and not have technology. They are going to, like, that's the next step. So I don't know if I'm making sense.
Anyone wants to respond to Janvi? I think you caught us napping.
I think it's interesting from that thought to think about practices of slowness or practices of differential speed. So, what makes you kind of, maybe not, I mean, I think the kind of point being made was that this is an endless kind of ever accelerating process. And that if one is going to kind of try and regain some idea of what is special, then one will have to look at slowing down to be able to kind of, how would you say, consider that. I don't know. I just had that sense that maybe it is about practices that allow for a variety of speeds rather than one of constant development and progress and so on.
So, Riaz, until we have another question, would you want to talk about again the medium of representation or anything of that kind?
No, I think, in fact, what I wanted to kind of reiterate that the first two exercises must be looked at separately. I see, I mean, just I get a sense that people, when they are talking about it, are kind of condensing the two into one and also condensing them to Delhi. These are both the first as well as this, and I think the first, it's been wonderful to see how people have started responding to it and kind of taking it in its abstract spirit. Similarly, as far as this exercise is concerned, what I would urge people to do is to separate it from the first exercise and think about it and imagine it in itself. I again think that as far as representation is concerned, there is no kind of stipulated manner in which you have to represent this. It is the manner that you think is either accessible to you or you think is appropriate to what you want to convey. I think those should be the criteria by which you decide. But Sudipta, was there a particular direction you were asking that question with me?
No, not really. I think because before you came onto the platform, we were discussing about the 22nd as a date for the individual exercises to kind of stop, and then the collective group exercise starts for the first exercise, and 25th being that day of kind of concluding the first exercise altogether, when the third exercise or part 2A, part 2B might be announced. So that's where I was kind of, I mean, the overlay of these exercises, the kind of format with which they have to submit or upload, all of this needs to be perhaps clarified to them. Yes. I think because there seems to be a little bit of confusion around that, and where should they submit and where should they upload and all of that. So I think 21st midnight or even 22nd morning, if we can have a place where we can put up all of the individual exercises for the first exercise, individual offers for the first exercise, that will be appropriate. And then we can, I think now it's been decided on how the group work would then ensue after that. But I think it would be good to kind of take a stop at on the 22nd and take stock of what we have and who all have reached where. And then individual groups can then take that forward. Also, I think within the various rooms, there are obviously two groups within each room, and those two groups need to be kind of highlighted or separated or whatever. That list also needs to be put out for everyone. So individually, then they can start almost strategizing how they would want to put that together for the 25th.
Yes. So I think, I mean, just so those lists we'll put up, I think tomorrow. I think that's fine. I mean, if there is, I think firstly, if we are concentrating on the individual part of the exercise till the 22nd, I think the participants, if they have any questions, should ask them now, because I mean, from what you're saying, I think it's pretty clear actually that they will, we will tell them where they have to put it up, but at that time they will. How the work proceeds from there on, of course they will be told clearly, but I'm just wondering if there's any lack of clarity up to the 25th.
So what we are really thinking is that it's the medium and the ways of expression are exactly the same as what it is for exercise.
For exercise,
that you could use.
It will actually, I mean, just so that there's clarity. The first 5 exercises will have largely the same. I mean, the freedom of and the choice of medium and the way that they are able to express themselves is completely something that is open. So I don't think that that is a question that for the first 5 exercises will come up again.